Launched in 1943, the USS Curb was a diver-class rescue and salvage ship, a vessel designed for rescuing ships and salvaging their cargo. It operated until 1983, then was sunk to create an artificial reef to promote marine life off Key West, Florida. The shipwreck sits upright on the ocean floor, much like it would have floated on the surface, submerged in deep water at a depth of 56 meters or 185 feet, a depth that could fit a building that's 18 stories high. The main decks of the ship, which are the levels you would find cabins and other facilities, are located between 130 and 160 feet deep. This means that the top deck of the ship is around 39 meters or 130 feet below the water's surface, while the lower decks descend to about 49 meters or 160 feet. It's a bit like a submerged multi-story building, with each floor being a deck of the ship. When diving deep underwater, the pressure increases, so divers need special equipment and training to handle it. They sometimes breathe a special mix of gases because regular air can be dangerous at those depths. To prevent decompression sickness, also known as the bends, divers must ascend slowly and take breaks. Symptoms of the bends include joint pain, dizziness, difficulty breathing, fatigue, itchy skin, and in severe cases, paralysis or unconsciousness. It's like letting the fizz out of a soda bottle slowly to avoid a messy spray. Divers must rise slowly to let their bodies adjust and avoid the painful fizz of decompression sickness. Divers visiting the site can explore the ship's small spaces and openings within the structure, now covered in marine life. Gary and Julie entered the water after most of the other divers. They followed the anchor line of the ship they had just got off and started swimming towards the wreck's superstructure, the part of the ship that is built above the main deck. The wreck emerged from the gloom, a skeletal structure that was once a bustling naval ship, an artificial reef now, but the ghosts of its past seemed to cling to the corroded metal. Fish darted through the broken portholes and corals clung to the hull of the ship. Nature was reclaiming the man-made giant. Around 5 minutes into the dive, Gary poked his head into the dark passageway that descended into the hull of the ship. He gestured to Julie, waving for her to follow him, but not being experienced divers, Julie was hesitant and refused, so they swam along the wreck to the next entrance, the hallway illuminated by sunlight streaming through the small round windows or portholes on the side of the ship. Again, he gestured, and against her best instinct, she reluctantly began to follow him in, thinking that they would only swim a bit inside. Julie's heart raced as she swam in. The water was still and undisturbed. Light from portholes cut through the darkness, revealing the sediment left on every surface. The silence was profound, broken by her and Gary's breathing. They were both unaware of the fine silt that lay like a blanket over the interior. One wrong move could cloud their vision, leaving them blind in the belly of the wreck. Then, Gary suddenly took off, and Julie struggled to keep up. The divers made a few turns and descended a narrow ladder to the deck below. The interior of the wreck was pitch black. They turned back, trying to swim towards the light. Yet, in their careless entry, they had kicked up sediment and now brown particles floated in the water. Their visibility was minimal. Moments later, the divers found the ladder, but after swimming up to the room above, they were separated. At this point, they were the only divers not back on the boat, and with increasing alarm, the boat crew began to search for them. The crew had brought many tourists on dives here, and they were keenly aware of how dangerous the dive could be. It was the warm, clear water outside the sunken ship that made the wreck seem like an easy dive. However, it could be randomly swept with violent currents, and its interior was a deadly maze easily trapping unwary divers. The dive master, Jack, was fully geared in minutes. Dropping into the water and descending to the wreck, he methodically but urgently searched for the two missing divers. To give you an idea of what Dive Master Jack was looking at, imagine a ship at the bottom of the ocean. The USS Curb from back to front is approximately 65 meters or 213 feet long. A large structure, the length of 2 school buses parked end to end. The ship stands tall, at 30 feet or 9 meters high, the height of a 3-story building. The ship is 12 meters or 40 feet wide. Think of a wide city street with enough space for cars to pass comfortably through. This all at 56 meters or 185 feet underwater. At this point, Gary had lost all his composure. Latching onto one of the portholes, he was trying to squeeze himself through the impossibly narrow opening. He missed Julie's signaling. They needed to trace their way back out to survive. Despite the warm water, a chill ran through Julie's body. Her oxygen showed less than 500 psi, about 1/6 of a full tank. On the surface, this would be about 17 minutes of air, but at this depth, under pressure, the compressed air would only give her minutes of breathing time. Gary was beyond help. There was nothing more she could do. She left him, swimming up another passageway. It was blocked. She swam back. Gary was still holding to the porthole, but now he seemed to be frantically waving to someone or something outside of the shipwreck. Jack, the experienced dive master, had spent years crewing boats and diving in these waters. He searched the main deck of the wreck, the stories of the divers who lost their lives in this exact wreck at the back of his mind. He never really thought of them much, but those stories seemed like just stories up until now. He checked to see if they were caught in the fishing line or netting that was part of the main deck. He didn't find them and began to fear the worst. Moving from the deck, he moved downward, just a short distance to look at the keel, the thick structure that runs along the bottom of the ship and sticks into the water. He wanted to see the point where the keel meets the sand at the bottom of the sea. Then he began to swim around the ship. Glancing at his gauges, they were lower than they should be. He consciously slowed down his breathing to a normal rate. In his anxious state, he was using too much of his air supply. He searched the area near the bottom of the ship, going around to the back of the ship and moving to the front from the other side. About halfway to the front of the ship, there was still no sign of the divers. Then a noise, accompanied by frantic thumps. He looked back and saw an arm hanging out of the porthole, desperately jamming the point of a knife into the outside of the vessel. Relief arrived and left just as quickly. The two divers were lost in the ship, and he did not have the equipment, experience, or training to retrieve them. He grabbed Gary's arm and shook it to get his attention. The arm disappeared inside. A terrified face replaced it in the porthole. There was no time for Jack to think. He needed to see their gauges. By the time he got through their panic and read both their gauges, Julie's was at 300 psi. He wrote the words "Be right back" on his diving slate, the writing board attached to his diving suit, and quickly ascended from the depths to the surface. As soon as his head was above water, he demanded the fullest tank they had, a diving regulator, the device that delivers breathable air from the scuba tank to a diver at the correct pressure. With little time on the clock, Jack and the captain decided to send a call to another boat with full tanks aboard and hoped they would have a qualified diver or at least the necessary equipment to conduct the rescue. The tank Jack was given was half full. It would have to do. He descended, reached the porthole, but the cylinder was millimeters too big to fit through the hole. He shoved the breathing devices attached to the tank through the porthole, held the tank and instructed them to breathe. They grasped the devices and started breathing heavily, consuming the air rapidly due to panic. Jack tried to soothe them, writing calm, breathe slow. He had help on his whiteboard. They were simple and easily understood phrases. His heart was racing too. He calmed himself down. In a rush, he secured the breathing apparatus to the ship's edge, guided Gary's hand to hold it, and quickly went back up for air. Realizing his own tank was nearly empty, he surfaced fast. He reached the boat. The captain was ready for this, and already had a spare tank set up. Jack inflated his vest to stay afloat, discarded it, grabbed the spare tank, and dove back in, urgently requesting even more air to be sent down. The captain shouted back, "What about decompression?" But his concerns went unheard in the chaos. Minutes ticked by. 2, 5, 10 minutes. Blurring together as Jack lost track of time in the adrenaline-fueled rush. He suddenly realized that his dive computer, the device that monitors his depth and time underwater to ensure safe decompression, was floating above with the abandoned flotation vest he removed earlier. He didn't know how long he had been underwater and wouldn't know his decompression needs and stops required on the way back up. Above the water, the captain and the dive group leader were battling their own fears. The dive group leader was young and inexperienced, saw the worry carved on the captain's face, and sensed the tension in Jack's hurried actions as he surfaced and dove again and again. It was a dangerous situation where every second counted, and the decisions made were made heavy with the risk of death. Gary and Julie were in this situation because they lacked the proper training and equipment. If they were better prepared, they might have never faced this dire predicament. Jack managed to stay in touch with Gary. Gary clung to the porthole on the sunken ship, desperate to survive. But at this point, Julie could not be seen. He could only hope she was using one of the emergency air supplies he provided them. Meanwhile, Jack was in trouble himself. He descended so quickly that he didn't have time to put on protective gear against the cold. Even though the water was warm at 29 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit, at this temperature, prolonged exposure leads to hypothermia because our bodies lose heat much faster in water than air. And even if the water felt warm, it was still cooler than his body's internal temperature, and he began to feel the severe chill that marked the onset of hypothermia. Jack may not have had his diving computer, but he knew that at 100 feet plus, he would have a significant decompression issue. Without knowing his diving profile, the time he needed to stop on the way up for decompression was not known. Even if he did, Could he even get the air supply or stay in the cold long enough to complete it? Gary was oddly calm. Maybe it was the cold numbing his fear, or that he sensed help approached. From Jack's limited view inside the ship, he could not spot Julie. Above them, the captain had called for assistance. A nearby dive vessel arrived, manned by Jim, a seasoned cave diver with extensive shipwreck experience. He modified his dive plan for a daring penetration rescue. A second diver, familiar with the wreck's layout, joined him. This diver would help Jim quickly find the best ways to enter the deep, dark shipwreck. Once they reached the ocean floor, this diver would wait nearby, ready to help if needed. Jim would enter the airy wreck, search for Gary and Julie, and then lead them out of the ship and back to safety. Jim dove with a recreational air tank and a small extra one, which unfortunately did not attach properly to his gear. He reached the sunken ship without any problems. He quickly figured out where the missing divers were inside the ship and used the passageway that got him close to them. Jim found Gary in a room, still holding the window and breathing from the air supply. Julie was nowhere in sight. He decided to get Gary out first. He gave Gary the air from the extra tank and led Gary to the other rescuer to begin decompression. Jim checked his own air supply, went back down to the shipwreck. Even though he had prepared himself for the worst, he was worried about what he would find next. When Jack saw that Gary was safe, he let go of the extra tanks he was holding from outside the porthole and began an immediate ascent. He was shivering violently. He knew that he was dangerously hypothermic, and it took his full concentration just to find and hang on to the ascent line. He stopped at 40 feet to wait for a bit, hoping another diver would be there to check on him and give him more air if needed. No one was there. His shivering was so uncontrollable now that he could barely hold on to the line. If he lost his grip, he would be swept away by the current. He was at a high risk of losing consciousness and drowning. For the length of time Jack spent underwater, he was fully aware of the risk he faced, a severe case of decompression sickness. Despite this, he chose to rise straight to the surface, hoping for help from the boat. Emerging from the depths, Jack surfaced near the front of the vessel. He was too exhausted to shout. He could barely manage to inflate his buoyancy device. He floated past the boat and was noticed. They leaped in the water, swimming to his rescue. Jack, drained of strength, couldn't even climb aboard by himself. They helped him remove the heavy diving equipment while in the water. With gentle and urgent care, they helped him onto the deck. He was wrapped in warm towels and immediately put on oxygen. The oxygen was meant to help with his decompression sickness. Jack tried to make sense of the numbness spreading through his legs. Was it the biting cold of the deep sea or the onset of decompression sickness? As Jack was being pulled on board, Jim below finally found Julie. She was dead, her motionless body behind a wall in the same room that Gary was found. With a heavy heart, Jim inflated her buoyancy control device, just enough to help transport her through the water. He began the journey back to the surface, towing her body alongside him. Julie's air tank was empty. She suffered a tragic fate. She drowned. Jim entrusted Julie's body to a diver above and then descended once more to fulfill a mandatory but brief decompression stop. Why Julie left her diving partner in the safety of the air supply at the porthole remained a mystery. Gary's memory offered no clues, his mind blank like a slate regarding the events that unfolded. Meanwhile, Gary's diving computer continued to signal a substantial need for decompression, a requirement that was quickly becoming impossible. They decided to bring Gary to the surface and put him on oxygen. As they were helping Gary onto the boat, Jack started to lose all feeling in his legs and felt extreme pain in his back. He was experiencing the bends from coming up from the deep water too fast. Next to Jack, Gary was placed on oxygen. On the way to the shore, Gary's symptoms of decompression sickness also became severe. When they reached land, both Gary and Jack were taken by ambulance to a special treatment center. Gary got better after treatment, but Jack did not recover completely. He never regained the full use of his legs, most likely confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. If you made it this far and enjoyed the video, subscribe. I'll see you next time when we face our fears together.